Good afternoon. This is Ed Wilkin with the accounting firm of Wilkin & Guttenplan. I'm a shareholder with the firm.
Moving on to today's program, how much you should have in your building and reserves. There's been a lot of discussion lately within our New York City Co-op and condo board meetings, and a lot of questions presented to us during the year regarding reserves and how much is enough. The pressure is on boards and buildings to look towards planning further out in the future and maybe reducing the tendency towards assessments or recapitalizations with new and higher loans and line of credit rolled into new debt. We are fortunate today to have a couple of great experts on our panel. Annette Murray, my partner, is a shareholder with Wilkin & Guttenplan. She has more than 25 years experience working with condominiums and co-op housing corporations, providing them with accounting, audit, and consulting services. She has spoken frequently on industry topics, including budgeting, understanding financial statements, and the role and responsibility of board treasurers. Young Soo, professional engineer, heads RAND's mechanical, electrical, and plumbing team and manages the firm's heating, cooling, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection projects. He works with RAND's physical condition survey team to conduct comprehensive evaluations of building systems and produce detailed reserve studies for cooperative and condominium boards, planning capital improvement projects. Young received his Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering at the University of Maryland and is licensed professional engineer in New York State and a LEED Green Associate. He is also a certified building commissioning professional, a certified level 1 thermometer in thermal infrared mechanical systems, a system fire and explosion investigator, and a New York State asbestos inspector. Our last speaker is Maria Arutunin. She's also on RAND's physical condition survey team, performs comprehensive building evaluations to assess the condition of the building systems and components for capital needs assessments and condominium offering plan reviews. Maria also prepares detailed engineering reports that document properties deficiencies, remedial needs, and budgetary items on a priority basis. Maria has a Bachelor of Architecture from Pratt Institute and is a certified level 1 thermographer as well. At this point, I'd like to do the first polling question so we can get a little bit about the audience. What is your position in relationship to your building? Are you a board member, property manager, professional, or other? Please answer the question. Okay, it looks like we have about half our board members, a third are property managers, and about 25% professionals and others. At this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Annette. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're very happy to be with you all here today. Today's program came about due to the frequency of us getting asked this question: how much should our building have in reserves? Properly dealing with reserves is a key part of the board's fiduciary responsibility for your building. So really, how much should your building have in reserves? One thing to think about the fact is that the answer to that question is an art and not a science. And we feel very strongly that engineering reports and financial projections are really the key to the answers to how much should your building have in reserves. And we're going to cover both of those things today. Many of you might be familiar with rules of thumb that a lot of times, management company firms and real estate agents have used over the years as to how much building should have in reserves. Some of them might be that our building has X number of months of carrying our common charges in our reserve fund. Another rule of thumb that's used frequently is a certain dollar per amount per unit. So some buildings might say we have $1,000 per unit in our reserve account. But the real answer to that is neither one of those numbers might be the right number. And one of the things I want to cover is to distinguish between capital reserves and operating reserves. We like to think about a building's finances in two different buckets. there is the operating budget and the day-to-day activities of the building, and then there's the capital reserves, which is the long-term monies that are needed. So capital reserves are for long-term major repairs and replacements, such as roofs, elevators, lobbies, HVAC, water towers, and the like. Operating reserves are what we consider to be excess operating cash, or really a cushion in a building's finances, which really is a best practice to have to be the best financially stable building that you could be. And it would deal with unexpected expenditures, operating expenses, or unexpected price increases. And a best practice would be to have about 2 to 4% of the budget as an operating reserve. And we really feel strongly that good planning by the board can minimize the surprises and financial hardship on shareholders and unit owners. And that's really important right now, especially after the last few years of coming through these really especially difficult financial times. Not all unit owners can just write a check for a capital assessment to deal with a major repair that needs to get done. So we really want to try and minimize any financial hardship on any unit owners.
We're now going to have our second polling question. The question is an easy, it's a yes or no question. Does your building have its reserve funds in segregated cash accounts? In other words, are the operation and the capital reserves in two separate bank accounts? Okay, we're seeing approximately 80% of you have separate bank accounts, and the balance of 25% do not. So that's a good showing.
Right. That is a good showing. That's an item that I'm going to be covering in a little bit more detail. So it really is a best practice for all buildings to have their reserve monies in separately segregated cash accounts, and I will touch upon that again shortly. So there's different types of reserve reports that a building could have an engineering firm do, and we're lucky enough to have Rand with us on this panel today. And Rand will be covering in quite amount of detail a capital needs assessments report. Another type of report that we see frequently outside of New York City is what's called a 30-year reserve study. It really is an industry standard report, and it lists all the common elements in a building that the building is responsible for placing. And it really deals with every single thing from lobbies, again, all the way to roofs. They put a dollar quantity replacement cost. They come up with an estimated replacement value. And it really is a long-term reserve study. Something that Wilkin and Gutton plan along with Rand is we're really trying to emphasize the importance of either having a capital needs assessments report, which we're going to be discussing, or a 5 to 10-year capital improvement plan. And I have an example of that on the next slide, which we'll talk about. But the engineering, these schedules really should be prepared by an engineer experienced with your building type and the type of report that your building needs. And this way it will help the board and the property manager really plan adequately. After the engineer report is done, if it's not part of the engineer report, there really should be a cash flow projection. And this is really important so the board can then see what kind of monies it will need over the next few years and then start planning on how they're going to come about getting those monies. So if we go to the next slide, it's just a very basic example of what we call best practices for a co-op, a 5-year capital improvement plan. And you can see the very first line starts with the balance in the reserves beginning of the year. So that's the segregated cash that the board has put aside for major repairs and replacements. And then in this example, this particular building was funding some money through the budget every year. So you could see in year 2013 they were adding $75,000, then the year 2014, $100,000 across the board. And then you can see in the year 2014, the building planned to have a refinance of the mortgage and get additional cash proceeds from the refinance of $750,000. So you can see at the beginning, pretty much the beginning of each year, what the total funds are available. Then next we have the projected expenditures. So this particular example, the building was going to have window upgrades. It knew what its local law 11 repairs needed to be. Engineering costs for the next rounds of the local law 11, and then lobby upgrade and some of the other expenditures, including a water tower replacement. So you can see that the last line of this slide shows what the projected balance in the replacement reserves at the end of the year is. And you can see 2013, we end the year at $135,000, 2014, $655,000. $215,000. You can see the building drops down to as low as $90,000 at the end of 2016. And I think that kind of emphasizes the importance of doing such a schedule, even though this is a very basic, simple schedule. It shows that at the end of 2016, the building is down as low as $90,000. If the building had one other unanticipated repair that needed to get done, it really would be short. So this kind of really does help the board project what's going to happen. And we happen to have this format in Excel. So if any of you at the end of the program, please email the contact information. I'd be happy to forward this to you, and you could put together your own schedule as needed. Just this is really like a cash flow projection. Again, this is not the engineering work that's so important that needs to get done to help prepare this. On the next slide, we're going to talk about funding for capital improvements. So the engineers are going to give you a wonderful report and let you know what the needs of your building are. Now, how does the board and management put together a plan to fund for those capital improvements? And what we're really seeing, and which is really another good practice, is probably a combination of the various avenues that you could go. One is a capital or special assessment. And a lot of times the unit owner shareholders are offered the opportunity to pay the capital assessment in a lump sum, pay it over time. A building can also get a line of credit from the bank, and what that does, it also helps smooth the impact of having these major repairs done. The line of credit could be paid back over a longer time than it is getting a capital assessment from the unit owners. The building can also acquire debt or refinance its existing debt, and condominiums also can borrow monies in New York. Again, you have to go back to your bylaws to take a look at that, but that definitely is an avenue for co-ops and condos, is to increase the current line of debt or get new debt. Another example that we could talk about is budgeting an annual contribution for reserves. Budgeting an annual contribution to the reserves, just like you do all your other operating expenses, is really an industry standard best practice outside of New York City. We are seeing more and more buildings, though, budget for the annual contribution to the reserves, because there's been a lot of attention paid to the FHA guidelines in regards to this matter, which I'm going to touch upon in another minute. And what we're really seeing, though, probably is a combination of all of the above. So we do see buildings, they do partly of a capital assessment, they'll partly use debt, and then sometimes they will budget a line item contribution to reserves. And it's a combination of all those sources of cash that allows the board to have the monies that it needs to do the projects that need to get done. And then if you're able to take this information, the information from the engineers, once you know your sources of cash, and then you can put together that 5 to 10-year capital improvement plan that we just looked at the slide before. Next, we're going to talk about some best practices. We feel very strongly that the engineer's report, whether it's a capital needs assessment report, a 30-year reserve study, and your capital improvement plan, cash flow projection, it really needs to be updated every 2 to 5 years. And this way, the board will always know where it's at with its needs over the next few years, and it can really plan. And updating it every 2 to 5 years really addresses any inflation issues and other things that might pop up unexpectedly. The engineer's report should also be updated after any major projects are completed or any major building problems are identified. So you might have had a study done just 2 years ago, but if all of a sudden there's some systemic issue with the building that got identified, it probably is a good idea to have that schedule updated. In regards to the reserve cash account, like we just asked how many of you had your cash account segregated, and it is the majority, it's very important to keep the reserve fund segregated in a separate cash account. We really don't want operating cash and reserve cash commingled. What we've seen a lot the last few years is that we are seeing buildings use reserve monies to pay for operating expenses and operating deficits. It's really important for the board and management to understand and explain to your shareholders and unit owners that the annual budget should support the building's operating expenses. You should not be dipping into reserve cash accounts to pay for operating expenses or any deficits. Ideally, you should not be using long-term funds, which again is your reserve monies, or any debt to pay for operating expenses. What we are seeing also is that we're seeing banks are refusing to do loans for any units that might need to refinance or new unit sales coming in for buildings that have had operating losses, and that's really a problem. We really like to visualize that a building has two buckets of funds. You have your operating funds and your reserve funds. The operating budget should be standing on its own and be supported by the shareholders and the unit owners by the carrying charges. and then the reserve should be a separate plan on how you're financing to take care of those types of projects. Another important best practice as you're doing these large projects is to consider sealed bids for some large projects. That's a good best practice.
Okay, we're going to have our third polling question. The polling question is, in the past 3 years, has your building borrowed monies from the reserve account to pay for operating expenses? As Annette talked earlier, taking money from the reserve account and using it to fund a deficit. Has that happened? Again, I like the results. We got 2/3 saying no and 1/3 saying yes. A lot of times, if you have a single bank account, it's hard to distinguish whether you're using reserve funds or not. So by having the separate bank account, it's a good thing. Okay, Annette?
All right. And in regards to that, as Ed just said, having the separate bank account really does keep the board and management focused on what monies are to be used for what purpose. Something that your building can consider is changing the accounting methodology for the building on the annual audit to be shown in a fund accounting presentation, which means there's a column of numbers showing the operating funds, which again is the day-to-day activities of the building. Then there's another column showing the reserve activity. So the reserve cash and the reserve transactions are segregated from the operating fund. Fund accounting is industry practice in the rest of the country. We probably have at Wilkin & Gutton Plan probably about a dozen New York buildings that do fund accounting. And I think the board has really found the fund accounting format helpful. Again, it's not necessary. We're more concerned, though, that the building has good reserves, that you have your engineering report done, and that you focus on keeping the reserve cash separate from the operating cash. But again, if anybody's interested in fund accounting, I'm going to go over, show you a slide or two to give you that presentation in a minute. One of the things I said I would touch upon is the FHA guidelines. If somebody wants to refinance their building, this is more for condominiums. If somebody wants to refinance their building and for resale, a lot of mortgages are following our FHA mortgages. And an FHA guideline that came out a few years ago is that in order to get that mortgage approved, they want to see 10% of the common or carrying charges in the annual budget be for funding of the replacement reserves for capital expenditures. So if it's pretty much industry practice in New York not to have a budget line item for reserves, how is it possible then for the building even to meet the 10% requirement? Well, it's really not possible. There's really only one way to get that waived, is if there's a full 30-year reserve study done by an engineer. They can get a waiver from the FHA on that requirement. So let's just say, though, the reserve study had said that you need 8% of the common charges to be added to reserves. The next year's budget needs to show that 8%. It might not need the full 10%. But there's really very little that can be done. I've had several conversations lately with a number of board members and property managers about the FHA guidelines again, and they're trying to see how they can work around it because it really is impacting sales and refinances in the buildings, and there's really nothing that could get done around this. We do have a handful of buildings in New York that are either at the 10% in their annual budget adding to reserves or working towards that just because of this FHA financing issue. Let's see. Another item for the board to consider is to develop an investment policy, again, for the excess operating and for your reserve monies. This way, as the board changes over, you don't have a new board member that comes in and thinks maybe that all the excess reserve money should be put into the stock market. We don't suggest that. We really think that a building's reserves and excess operating money should be conservative with no risk of loss of principal. So it's a nice idea to have an investment policy. And in summary, we really want to talk about and focus on the fact that developing a long-term plan for capital spending is a positive step in the right direction for your building. When we go to the next slide, here's a sample. It happens to be for a sample co-op, but you can see here, hopefully a little bit on your screen, that you can see the different columns that we're talking about. So this is a 2011 report in which you see the 3 columns to the left. The first column is the operating fund, so that's all the assets and liabilities relating to that building that are considered operating. Next, we have a capital and replacement funds, which again are all the monies and assets and liabilities related to long-term reserves. And then we have a total column, which is obviously the the sum of the two columns to the left. Then we show a total column of 2011 compared to 2010. So this really is a good, we believe, a very nice presentation to help the board and management really plan and keep track of the assets and liabilities related to the operations versus reserves. On the next slide, you can see what we call the profit and loss statement, or the statement of revenues and expenses. And you can see it's also broken out between the operating and the capital and replacement fund. First column, operating fund, day-to-day activities of running the building, all your revenues and all your expenses. The second column in, you can see under revenues, there's an allocation of investment income to the replacement fund, but you could also see the capital assessments that were done for the year were added to the replacement fund. So we really are tracking the revenues and expenses for the replacement fund in a separate column and then matching that up with the cash. Let's see, do we have another polling question yet?
Nope.
Almost. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Annette, thank you for your presentation, and we'll take questions. I don't know if we have any questions yet.
I think we had one question on what is a sealed bid.
Yeah.
So why don't I take that question?
Yeah.
As I'm sure many of you know, when projects need to get done at the building, usually the board will give instruction to the property manager to obtain some bids from various vendors. So let's just say it's a lobby renovation. That's a bad example. We know how controversial that is. Let's just say we need a new boiler. So we need a new boiler, and the managing agent will go out to several contacts that they have had good experience with and get some proposals. For very large projects, we really think a sealed bid is a great idea. And what we mean by a sealed bid is that the bids, the request for proposals are sent out to the contractors, and in that request for proposal, it specifically says who to send the bid to, so that it probably goes to a board member or somebody on some kind of a committee. And what it does, it really gives the highest and best chance of getting independent bids with quotes without being influenced by any discussions of pricing and things like that. So this way then, a lot of times the board will then open up the bids together, and then someone will analyze the contents of the response to the request for proposal, and then the board of management will do a good thorough analysis of all the proposals that were received. But the whole key piece is that it's sealed, and it's not going to one person that could kind of talk about pricing and things behind the scenes. So it's just a good protection. Here's a question I have here. How do condominiums get lines of credit? Well, you speak to a nice banker. So I'm not being facetious on that. There are definitely banks in New York that are willing to give condominiums lines of credit. And unlike co-ops, where the corporation that owns the building actually has an asset to be liened, a lot of people do not think that condominiums have assets in line, but they really do. They could take a lien in the future common charges of the building, and I think Ed would like to speak to that too.
With condominiums, in contrast to co-ops, a lot of times lines of credit are going to be dealt with more with capital projects during the project's phase. So when the work is being done, then that's rolled over into a term loan. I see very few buildings, condominiums, getting just lines of credit to deal with operating expenses and being kept open on a long-term basis. So a lot of them are dealt with capital projects.
Oh, yeah, and again, we would discourage getting a line of credit to pay for your operating bills. The monthly common charges coming in really should be able to run the building. You should not be incurring debt to pay for operating bills. We have another question here. What types of investments would be recommended as safe, again, with no loss of principal for a co-op or a condo? And again, we're talking about not very exciting and very low interest rate certificates of deposits, T-bills, and things like that. Some buildings sometimes get into mutual funds that are backed by T-bills, but we're really not too excited about the mutual funds either, because there is risk of loss with the mutual funds, even though they are backed with T-bills, and that's really what's making up the investment. So I think that's everything that we have on our part. I think Ed will. We're going to turn the program over now.
All right, I'm going to now introduce the next two speakers. Young and Maria are going to talk to you about the actual capital need reports, but right now we're going to have our last polling question just to see how many of you are currently have done these programs before, or and the question is, when was the last time you performed an assessment and you can see the answers there. Please fill those in. I'm very happy to see that almost 65% of you have had some type of an assessment program done in the last 5 years, and only 25% have never had them done. So that's very good news. Okay, Young and Maria.
Okay. Hello, my name is Young Soo. I'm the mechanical team leader here at RAND. As a part of my duties, I work with the TCS team here at RAND to do these capital reserve assessments, as long as, in addition to building evaluations, construction defect surveys, things of those natures. So I sort of wear 2 hats here. Maria does this full time. She's on the architectural side. So the report is pretty much divided into 2 different sections. The opening part is more architecturally based. The second portion is more essential systems, which we refer to as for the mechanical systems, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, plumbing, things along those lines. Maria is going to go ahead and give you some examples of what she looks for in the architectural portions and some things that you as unit owners and managing agents can be aware of, and also give you a sampling of what our reports look like.
Thanks, Young. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Maria, and as Young said, I'm part of the physical condition survey team here at RAND. So I do this full time. I perform numerous building surveys, and we prepare different kinds of reports here. And today we're going to focus on the capital needs assessment. And before we get into the contents of that report, I want to take you through the steps of what will typically happen if you engage in this process with us. So the first step would be to collect any sort of building documentations, warranties, drawings, or other information that would help us to understand the building prior to our site work. That could include a history of repairs, and which could help us determine the age of different systems at the building, for example, the roofing system, to understand, when is the last time you may have done certain repairs will help us get a handle on what the future needs of the building may be. The second step would be to perform our visual site work, and that's a team effort. We typically have between 3 to 4 people, including a licensed architect and engineer, on site to basically perform a roof-to-cellar review of the building, and everything from the cellar to the common hallways, the windows, representative apartments, roof surfaces, parapets, building exteriors. We'll go into that in detail later on in the survey, but so yeah, the most important part of our process, of course, is the site work. The third step is for us to prepare the report, including the photographic supplements, which documents all of the deficiencies that we may have uncovered that require short-term repairs, or sometimes it might be longer-term repairs. In addition, of course, is noting the capital planning needs of the building, basically systems that might not need repairs now, but we anticipate that they're going to be due for upgrades or replacement within the span of the report, which is typically at least 15 years, up to 25 or 30, as Annette said. The fourth step after we issue the report is a follow-up meeting. So once we issue the report, which is typically a lengthy report with lots of photo supplements, we include a follow-up meeting with the board to address questions, concerns, and prepare next steps for the building going forward. So now I'm going to get right into the report contents. Again, we have narrative system descriptions. This is something that I think is very helpful in our report, which is not only, we don't just write the work that needs to be done and how much it's going to cost. We do have narrative descriptions which describe the system and the components for every major system at the building. Then we go into itemized descriptions of the individual components. So within the exterior walls, which is the larger system, we'll talk specifically about bricks or limestone or granite or other individual materials that make up that system. Each item that we discuss in the report will be followed either by a budgetary recommendation, including the projected time frame, or an action item if it's just an informational item for the board, or if some documentation needs to be requested. Budgetary recommendations are grouped in approximately 3-year segments, so we'll show you whether you can expect to be performing these repairs in 3 years or in 10 or anything in between. Each building section is going to be followed by a detailed photo supplement, which shows overall images of the system as well as detailed defects that we may have found, and we'll show you an example of that later in the presentation. And then the last part of the report, of course, is the most important part, which is the anticipated funding summary spreadsheet. And again, we'll show you an example of that later, and that just basically is the bones of how much money you can expect to spend for each item going forward. Okay, so here we just pulled a table of contents from a sample report, and we do this just because I want to show you the structure of the report. Go back to table of contents. Here we go. So I just want to show you the structure of the report and how it's outlined. We have an executive summary and introduction that really gets into the history of the building, the age, the construction type, the classification type. We'll do some research into the DOB to see whether there are open violations or, other building-specific information. After that, we split the report up, as Young said, into architectural systems, which is Section A. You'll see that says building exterior and interiors. And Section B, essential services, which includes all of the mechanical, electrical, plumbing. As you can see there, there's intercom, refuse, and anything else that's under essential services. So that's basically how the report is broken down. And within those two sections, each building system gets its own designated section. So as we go forward, you'll see this is our typical introduction, which describes the purpose and the objectives of the report, as well as the structure and the history of the building. And then if we go forward one more, this is just a sample, a peek inside our report, if you will. Here you can see how the report is outlined. So the very first part, right under the section title, is where we do the narrative system description to describe the full components of that particular system. This happens to be exterior walls, windows, and doors. So we'll give a description of the type of exterior walls, the type of windows that could be found, the types of doors, and then we'll go in to the itemized description of each system. And as you can see, each paragraph or each item, which is headed by the letters A, B, C, D, is followed by these action line items, which either give a replacement or repair cost, or sometimes, as you'll see on the bottom right at the end of page 2, it may just be an informational item and may not have a cost associated to it, but we want to include it for the board's information. So you'll see this different types of recommendations may be for short-term, just something that would fall within 1 to 3 years, or we could have long-term recommendations which would fall anywhere from 5 years up. And some things might repeat. So if we are looking at a 30-year reserve study, you will probably need to do brick-mortar joint repointing more than one time, and we'll have that listed twice just based on the anticipated lifespan of certain systems.
I'd like to interrupt and there's a couple questions here that are really pertinent to what you're talking about.
Sure.
One question we have is what is the range of both time and cost to prepare one of these type reports, and what percentage of co-ops in New York do you think are getting these kind of reports performed based on your experience?
Well, I'm sure Annette could specifically answer what percentage of co-ops are actually getting these types of reports.
Yeah, probably not as many as should be. That's what, again, that was one of the reasons we really felt strongly about having the webinar today and partnering with RAND on it, because we really feel the engineer reports, every building should have an engineer's report, because the board and manager really do not know what's coming up ahead without having some kind of an assessment of the building done. So the right answer would be 99%. We'd love to see that. Right now, we're seeing, a very small percent of the buildings have these reports. So again, it's really a best practice for the building to have that, and then the frequency and cost.
Right. So in terms of at least the reports that RAND prepares, I would say that we do multiple different types of survey studies. In terms of these capital needs assessments, I would probably say it's less than 10%, maybe even much less than 10%, less than 5%. A lot of them are defect surveys. A lot of times what ends up happening is the managing agent or the board members are receiving complaints from certain unit owners, and then they sort of gear toward that specific item. Maybe if they're having leaks from the roof or their boiler is faulty. So they'll bring us in and they'll have us look at that one specific system rather than the entire building as a whole. So they're looking at what their options are for that one system, but not necessarily taking into account all of their capital needs. Now, in terms of the cost for these types of reports, it really depends on the type of facility and the level of detail that the board and the project manager is looking for. I would probably say cost-wise, again, it's going to vary, but it would be probably minimum $8,000 and up, really depending on the level of detail you're looking for. The time to prepare the report actually takes quite a while. I'd probably say on average maybe 6 to 8 weeks to prepare the report, because as Maria mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of documentation up front that we would like to review, any building drawings, any repairs that have been recently done. We'd like to see all of this information up front so we have an idea of what we're looking at when we get to the building. Any list of complaints. Sometimes we'll even send out a survey to the unit owners. We'll prepare it, we'll send the link, a web link, and we can have the entire, it goes out to every single shareholder in the building, and they can report back, yes, they have leaks, yes, they have this problem with their electrical system, yes, my apartment is too hot in the summertime, too cold in the wintertime. So when we get those type of surveys, it gives us a good idea of where to sort of focus our attention. We still look at the entire building, but if we're getting over 50% complaining that it's too cold in the wintertime, then the heating system is something that we definitely have to pay attention to. So all of this stuff and just compiling all the information that we get generally takes a while. So ballpark 6 to 8 weeks.
Right. At a minimum, I would say. And of course, it depends also on the size of the building. There's a very big difference in surveying a 25-unit building versus, recently we did one of these on a building that was more than 400 units. It may take several weeks just to get through the site work for that project.
All right, we've got a tremendous amount of great questions. One of them is, how are aesthetic renovation projects treated? Are they strictly discretionary? I think if you asked every shareholder, you'd get a different answer on that. Usually, in my opinion, when a building has limited funds and resources, what the board and management is going to do is going to fix something that, from a safety standpoint and a building mechanical standpoint, they're going to take care of those kind of projects first. And aesthetic projects, most likely, unless the building has a lot of money or the shareholders and unit owners are not adverse to capital assessments, probably an aesthetic project is going to be at the bottom of the priority list. So it's possible that those will not get done, maybe in the same priority order that some of the unit owners would like.
Right, and I do want to add that we do take custom requests into account for these reports. Sometimes we will have a board that we engage for one of these reports, and they'll ask us to factor in elective or aesthetic capital improvements that they may be considering for the future, such as, you said, a lobby renovation or a green roof installation. And in that case, we'll certainly pay attention to that and describe the necessary steps in the report, because those are, those are costs that need to be anticipated, and so it goes along with that as well. I want to address the question that we have: is scaffold rigging required for this type of assessment? Scaffold rigging is not required for our site work. We will handle it strictly from the street, from roof terraces. Sometimes if we can get access to a building across the street, we do have high-powered binoculars and high-powered camera equipment to help us observe conditions if it's a very tall building, but scaffold rigging is not required for the assessment. However, I do want to add that if we recommend work in the report that requires scaffold rigging, those costs will be reflected in the report.
Correct, and then most of our observations are going to be strictly visual based. We make visual observations of any systems that are visible. If probes are required and we don't have time or we don't have authorization to do those probes during the preparation of the report, we will note that in the report saying this issue was either reported, documented, or we observed something going on where we think further investigation is required. In those situations, we'll say, we think we need probes to either view the plumbing, to view ductwork, to view whatever happens to be currently behind a finished surface. So we'll recommend that, and then as a follow-up, we can go ahead and engage in a contractor. Sometimes the superintendent themselves will open up the probe, and we can come back on site and make the observation, and then update our report to reflect that new information. But any questions that you have, please keep them coming in. we can address them as we're going through our presentation. Do we have another one that we want to answer?
Why don't we, since we're getting close to our time frame, why don't we spend a few more minutes going through some of the slides Maria, that you have, I think, and then we can come back to some questions.
Great.
Sure.
What we have coming up is good.
Right. So these are excerpts from the anticipated funding summary chart, which is really the bare bones of the budgets that you are going to be looking at. I know this can be kind of overwhelming if you look at it, but it really is quite makes sense. So basically what we have is a listing on the left. You'll see a listing of every single action item that was listed in the report, whether it had a repair cost or a replacement cost associated with it, or even if it was just an informational item. We list every single action item that was described in the verbal report. And then the prices are listed on the right side and then broken out over the year in which they occur. So you could take a look at this chart and see what costs are going to come up for you in year 5, what costs are going to come up in year 8, in year 12. Just to keep this simple, we had, for the purposes of clarity, we had the costs here fall just in the year in which they occur. Sometimes, depending on the board's request, we may split the costs evenly over the previous years. So if you have $100,000 hitting in year 5, we'll show $20,000 hitting in years 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 so that you can prepare and build up to that $100,000 figure. So this is just a sample from within the body of the chart. And then on the next slide is really the bottom number. This is the totals page that shows you the summary of how much funding is required for each building system over the course of the next, I believe this is a 15-year report. Again, broken out by section and then totaled, and we have a contingency allowance as well as an engineering allowance added to that so that you can really look at the big picture number on the bottom left of what we expect the building to need over the course of the next 15, 20 years. And keep in mind, this is a very large number because this is pulled from a very large report, a 35-story building with over 400 apartments, so don't let that number scare you. This is a sample photo supplement. This photo supplement, again, will follow each of the 11-plus sections of the report. So we'll show overview photos as well as details of conditions that we found. We really want this to be a roadmap for the board and the property manager to take our report and be able to, visually understand it and see the locations that we were noting specifically. So here are some examples of counterflashing that we anticipate needs replacement in a certain number of years, and we show the reasons why and the specific locations which we think may fail earlier than others. Again, we're showing some defects in the flashing on the upper left. We're pointing out the specific conditions that will require repairs. In this particular case, this building had leaks, so we paid a lot of attention to the flashing because it was suspected to be the cause of the leaks, and we would list that then in a short-term recommendation because it was a priority for the board to repair the leaks as soon as possible, ahead of maybe some other capital improvement projects. This is part of our example from an exterior wall photo supplement. So this is for section 2. And again, we go into great detail here because we found a lot of brick defects at fire escape anchor penetrations. And again, we really just wanted to point out and quantify all of the defects that we found. So now we can just go into a brief details on what falls under each section. It's really pretty cut and dry. We have roof levels, terraces, and balconies is going to include absolutely any component that falls under those levels. Roofing materials, any recreational equipment or furniture such as pavers, railings, parapet walls, copings, skylights fall under that. Roof level doors or hatches, and vent terminations. So really anything that's affecting your roof levels and your roof systems. Exterior walls and windows, again, whether you have a masonry facade or an aluminum and glass curtain wall system, the review will include that. Windows, exterior doors, louvers, canopies. site exterior can be quite extensive depending on the size of the building and whether or not there are any playgrounds or other facilities annexed to the building, but generally it will include sidewalks, that includes curbs, building joints, site walls, retaining walls, stairs, steps, any kind of plants, trees, or any other decorative elements, really anything that falls outside of the building envelope. Common interior spaces, basically anything inside the building that is not inside of an apartment. So that would include any of your mechanical spaces in terms of the finishes, the lobby, the stairs, the hallways, the cellar, laundry room, again, anything that's outside of an apartment. And apartment interiors, of course, we say it's written here that it's not always applicable. What we cover in the apartment interiors will depend heavily on the particular bylaws of the condo or co-op that we're working with. Sometimes, for example, flooring repairs may be specifically listed as the responsibility of the unit resident. Sometimes they're the responsibility of the board. So it just depends on the particular bylaws, which we will take into account when we do this survey. And then we can go into the description of the MEP systems.
Correct. So Young here again. And just further elaborating on what Maria had mentioned about some items not always being applicable, what we're presenting here is just a basic list of the typical things that we look at. And every building is going to be slightly different. There may be buildings that you might have an indoor swimming pool that you want us to take a look at. So we don't necessarily will list that in this type of review, but any particular building amenities or facilities that your particular building has, you know, if you let us be aware of that you want us to go ahead and review that, we are more than happy to accommodate. In terms of the electrical systems, in terms of the mechanical systems, and I think we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll go through this quickly so we have some time to answer questions at the end. If you have any questions you want to bring up, feel free. But one of the main things that we look at is the actual condition of the existing main electrical equipment and also the electrical service sizing. One of the things with a lot of New York City buildings is some of them are 100 years old and the electrical service was sized for what was anticipated, what the anticipated electrical service need was for 100 years ago. But I think most of us recognize that we are consuming much more electricity these days. So we'll take that into account. We'll take into account current codes, current recommendations, and also whether or not the existing systems will support anything new. There's a question that was pointed out to me. It says, do your reports take into account the costs associated with the mandated phasing out of the use of number 6 and number 4 heating oil and conversion costs to gas? If that was requested, yes, we can definitely do so. Obviously, if you're not operating on number 6 or number 4, you wouldn't have, you wouldn't want us to include that in the report. But when we get over to the next section, the very next slide, heating, ventilation, you can see that the very bottom item there is the fuel system, which is typically gas or oil. I'm sure most of you are aware that number 6 oil is being phased out. Number 4 oil is essentially being phased out also because you can no longer do any new installations with number 4. If you have to do a boiler replacement, you can no longer go back to number 4. So you're pretty much going to be locked into either number 2 oil or natural gas. A feasibility study for the conversion to gas would not necessarily be included because there's a lot of detail that we'd have to look into, and we also want Con Edison's involvement. So that's kind of outside the scope of this type of report, but we can put in a ballpark number if that is requested. Other things that we'll look at are boiler replacements. We'll look at the age of the boiler, let you know, hey, we think this boiler has to be replaced in 10 years, and we'll budget that, and we'll give you the $400,000 line item or whatever it happens to be. If your building is provided with a central air conditioning system, chillers, cooling towers, things along those lines, we'll look at that. If individual units are heated and cooled by PTAC units that are the responsibility of the condo, then we'll look at that also. So anything so that the board and the property manager are aware of where your monies, your capital expenditures could possibly fall into. Other items, ventilation systems, pumps and controllers. So all of those items we'll look at. In terms of plumbing, gas, and fire protection, we'll look at your domestic water service. If you're not provided with a double check valve or an RPZ, some type of backflow preventer, that's the big thing that most buildings are being given a notice of violation on. So we're looking at that, and even if you haven't been given a notice of violation, we'll probably put that in as a capital expense that you'll need in the next 5 years, because I almost guarantee you, if you haven't been given a notice, you'll probably get one within the next 2 or 3 years. Stormwater drainage systems, your sanitary drainage systems, if you're having reported backups or low flow, maybe a booster pump if you're having low pressure on the upper floors, we'll definitely look into that. A house tank at the roof, if it needs to be replaced, we'll have that in our assessment, and we'll give you a dollar amount and time frame in terms of when it needs to be replaced. Elevator systems are something that we will look at. We'll look at the condition of the cab. We can make a recommendation on whether or not it should be refurbished. It's kind of more of an aesthetic thing, so it really is going to be on a case-by-case basis. But the machines themselves, the hoist machines, the conditions of the cable, the actual quality of the elevator machine room, we'll look at that as part of our review. Intercoms and security systems. Not every building is going to have an intercom or security system or cameras, but we'll look at that. We'll give you a if it's not operating properly, or if there's some improvements that we can suggest, or whether or not we project that there will have to be some upgrades in the future, that'll be included in our report. And the trash removal system, the refuse disposal system. Most buildings, most high-rise buildings are provided with a trash compactor. There are certain codes that are required, so we'll definitely look at the code issues and let you know if we find code deficiencies and something that has to be addressed right away, or whether or not it's just maybe a capacity issue of the compactor, a reliability issue of the compactor, the available hose and floor drain for cleaning if your room isn't provided with that. Those are the type of recommendations that we're going to look at. At this point, I think we have a couple minutes left. Maybe we'll open it up to some quick questions.
Yeah, thank you, Maria and Young. I see a question on that dreaded subject, windows, and it's probably one of the biggest items that our problem is because of the ownership responsibility of replacing those. A lot of times they're the responsibility of the unit owner to replace
In a condo.
In a condo, and how do you get them to do that so sometimes, and I think you need to probably talk to your attorney in this situation, is deal with how your bylaws deal with these things, and if it's a situation where you can mandate it. For instance, there's a mandate with dryer vents in a townhouse style project that they have to be cleaned every year and an inspection report sent. You could probably do the same thing with the windows and have the windows replaced on the building level, and then assessing the unit owner, because the windows might be different sizes depending on the size of the unit. I'm going to pass over a question on steam to Young.
Well, the question is any issues about Con Edison steam. Not all buildings have Con Edison steam. It's something that Con Edison is actually looking to unofficially phase out. They're trying to get out of the business. They're not signing up, from what I'm aware of, they're not signing up any new customers for Con Edison steam. But yes, a Con Edison steam service would be included in our report. We will look at your pressure reducing station, look at the condition of your room. One of the things that you as property managers and board members can look at is your steam room should not exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in ambient temperature. So if you walk in there and it feels like it's 120, you can put a thermometer inside, you have a problem. You're going to need some more insulation. You're going to need ventilation in that room, because temperatures like that will deteriorate your pressure reducing station for your Con Edison steam. But yes, we will look at that type of system.
Yeah, one of the questions that came along, is we know we only have an hour to spend together, that some of the samples of the capital needs assessment report was maybe gone by a little quickly. And if you email the contact information that we provided on the PowerPoint presentation, Rand would be able to send you a sample report, and a proposal for doing some work for your building. So that's definitely something that's available. And we've got quite a number of great questions. So one question is, how does the board keep its annual common charge increase at a minimum 2 to 3% and still comply with the 10% reserve fund? Well, let's think about that. It's not going to be too easy, because we're looking to raise the common charges. We need to add a brand new line item in a budget that's never been there before to be 10%. Some buildings have in their annual budget a line item called contingency, and it's usually not a very large item, but part of that contingency number can be relabeled annual reserve contribution. and then maybe a building takes a position for the next few years instead of having a 2 to 3% increase, which, by the way, we've seen much higher percentage increases for most buildings the last few years, and take some of that percentage and increase the percentage. Instead of 2 to 3, maybe it's 3 to 6, and take some of that percentage and add it to the annual reserve contribution. Over time, build that budget line items until it meets this 10% FHA requirement.
I just want to add something to that. Remember, the 10% reserve fund, once you add it the first year, you don't have to increase it substantially more for the following years. And also remember, if you have some key items that you're replacing structurally during the year, let's say you needed a $200,000 contribution. If you're spending $150,000 on some structural items, so $200 is going into your budget, but you're spending it out of the reserve fund, $150. So you're not doubling up $150 plus the $200,000. So just a note on that.
We do also have a question about how local law, I'm assuming 11, factors into our engineering reports. That's absolutely something we will look at. If you have a building that's over 6 stories tall, you're required to comply with facade inspections that occur on at intervals of every 5 years. We will certainly look into when your cycle is due. We will make a recommendation to have you prepared to undertake that. If you already have previous reports that have been done, we will certainly look at that information, and as much as we can, we will compare it to the existing conditions and see if any remaining items need to be addressed. And we'll factor in your status, whether you had swarm or safe or unsafe. So that's certainly a part of our assessment.
Yeah, we'll look at it, but an actual local law 11 report is a different type of report. So you cannot substitute this capital needs assessment report for a local law report, even if we have a section in there, because the DOB has very strict guidelines on what they're looking for.
Annette, the question, we're really running out of time, but Annette, the question on whether this type of report would comply with CAI's National Reserve Study standards.
Right.
My belief is that CAI, the national study, is a 30-year study.
Yeah.
So it would not, this case would not apply.
That's right. Yeah, for those of you that are on the webinar that are familiar with CAI, that's Community Associates Institute. It's a national trade organization for condominiums and co-ops and homeowners association. It does not really have much of a presence in New York City, the 5 boroughs at all, but that particular organization does have reserve study standards and certifications that the rest of the country kind of follows. And the current reports that get done in New York City, for the most part, do not follow that format unless it's a full 30-year reserve study and it follows certain wording and report formats.
We have prepared a couple of those in the past, but
okay.
Specifically for that type of need. So if you have that need and you need a report that specifically conforms to that requirement, then yes, we can perform that. But we have sort of a customized format that we provide here, but we can follow that national standard if required.
Right. Let's see. I'll try and hit 2 more questions. Here's one. How does is it dangerous for a co-op to have refinanced and already have maxed out its line of credit? Well, in my mind, it's not dangerous if the operating expenses and the common charges that are being charged are enough to carry and pay all the current operating expenses as well as the debt on a building. But if the co-op needs to have a lot of capital projects done and the shareholders are adverse to any capital assessments, then where is the money going to come from? So it definitely sounds like that particular board might need some capital expenditure planning done.
Okay, there's another question that says, benefits of using one firm to perform the assessment and another to do the actual work. I see it as there's a benefit and also a disbenefit. The benefit of using one firm to actually prepare the assessment and another firm to actually prepare the specifications for the work is you have 2 sets of eyes on the plan. You have 2 sets of eyes looking at an issue, and you can get a second opinion, and a second opinion never really hurts. The bad part about it is if you already have a professional who's experienced in the property, already has a history with your board, and already has a history with the issues that your building is currently experiencing, then maybe they would be better off in preparing the specifications because they know some of the underlying issues or some of the related issues that maybe somebody coming in new doesn't. But again, I see no reason. We're all professionals. If you need to bring in somebody else to take a look, to give it a second opinion, I'd say there's no harm in it, except for whatever fees might be associated.
All right. Thank you, of that question, Young. I think at this point we need to end. The rest of the questions, there's a couple we didn't get to. We will email you a response and answer those questions one-on-one. So at this, I'd like to thank our speakers for being here, and thank you all for attending. And we hope you look forward to one of our other programs coming up soon. Thank you.